The weekly message of the United Church of Christ of Homelstown, Pennsylvania, a podcast version of our worship service. To learn more and listen to the rest of the worship, check us out online at homelstownucc.org.
What a feast of scriptures we have this week. So much so that I have included 5 in our service today. I will say there was an alternate psalm that I also could have included. So we could have had the total of 6. I did cut it down to 5. In a fun twist of irony, the topic of several is Sabbath, when I'm certainly making Carol do a lot more work up here this morning. Something we have equated rest and relaxation to in our cultural understanding, Sabbath, right? But what is at the heart of Sabbath can really confuse the issue by equating it to a life of ease. A day that lacks employment is not the same as a day off. I'm sure most of you know that from weekends following busy work weeks, where we're just as busy, but with different tasks. It may be a Sabbath, but it's not unfilled. As we opened ourselves to worship this morning, I read those verses from Deuteronomy midway through the 10 Commandments that spell out the need for keeping the Sabbath and how it was understood as a memorial to overturned historical injustice. Sabbath, as practice, was meant to early Israelite communities to be a community remembering of enslavement. But to require that of the entire community also meant that it must be done all at the same time, right? There can be no split schedules if literally everyone, including the stranger and travelers, are required to drop everything for an entire day each week, ensuring even the animals that labor are released as well. But when the world moves 24/7, is that even possible? In a multi-religious world, is that practical? What happens when Sabbath is institutionalized is both wonderful and helpful and presumptive and problematic. In modern Judaism, the Shabbat, Sabbath, has a prohibited list of activities, which is pretty lengthy: writing, erasing, tearing, business transactions, driving or riding in cars or other vehicles, shopping, using the telephone, turning on or off anything that uses electricity, lights, radios, ovens, TV, cooking, baking, kindling a fire, gardening, grass mowing, doing laundry. And refraining from some of those might seem a clear reference to our Deuteronomic law, and some are much more inconvenient or unclear how they might violate the intent of Sabbath, like electricity, especially when it's getting hot in the middle of summer, right? Or cooking. But it certainly could encourage the community to keep focused on the why of Sabbath, to be thus inconvenienced. So it probably is understandable why by the time of Jesus and his disciples, some of those rules could be questioned in how they're supporting the cause of Sabbath, remembering and caring for community because of a history of unfair systems. If the disciples are working to feed themselves when they're hungry and needy walking through that field, should that satisfy the Sabbath requirement to support the needy because you were enslaved? Or should it be violated because they're doing something? Is it work for someone to perform CPR and save a life? Regardless of the day of the week, it is. What about a commandment in our modern days to do no harm? This is what Jesus argues when he heals the man's hand in the process of angering the religious leadership. Maybe in part because they are confronted with the injustice of what is put in place to celebrate justice. One commenter has said that standing at the receiving end of God's grace and justice, we are called to extend that saving grace to others, especially those over whom we exercise power. This dual emphasis of taking what we learn from the vertical dimension of our life with God and expressing it in the horizontal dimension of our life in community lies behind the rationales for the command to observe the Sabbath. But the experience of doing that, of holding those dimensions in order, is something that is constantly and must be constantly in conversation. If the why of holding Sabbath is not maintained because we're holding too tightly to the actions of holding Sabbath, we have not fulfilled God's intent at communal remembrance. We have not allowed our history to create sustained world change. In our epistle reading from 2 Corinthians, Paul speaks to this tension by equating his calling to share the good news with the phrasing of treasure held in clay jars, an easily cracked, dropped, spilled, vulnerable container for God's message to spill forth from. This symbol of fragility then can be a reminder that the work of the Spirit has to be the focal point, not the holder, not the letter of the law, but the reason for the law, the livingness of our living God. A living God who knows and loves and supports us fragile, frail little human beings who knit us together personally, as our psalm reminds us. This loved and respected and wonderful body in which we live and move and work and spend our lives, including our Sabbath days. The fragility of clay jar as container for treasured word and the exquisiteness of God's formative nature in our lives points us towards a Sabbath practice that is critical to remember. It isn't just that rest is encouraged in Sabbath keeping, but the day is meant to be kept holy, to be a community connection and a routine yet divine day of remembrance, a day to meditate on the transcendence, the everywhereness of God, and the immanence, the closer than breathing of God. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all of my ways. I praise you, for you and I are wonderfully and fearfully made. As simple as it sounds, it is a lifetime commitment to attempt to offer praise for God's work. It is the meaning, mindful experience of a meditation master to live into those affirmations of God's goodness at all times for all beings. God, who knows us and loves us so fiercely, and who calls out to us, is most often beyond our perception. Whether we're following the laws of faith or not, whether we're sitting in silent, contemplative, listening stances, or moving through the world, God's offering of law and rule and schedules of remembrance was all given to connect all people together with God through that relationship to those who surround us. And this is what is at the heart of that reading about Samuel. A third week of scriptures focused on call stories, the moments that lead us to develop faith. For each of us, the voice of God comes in different ways. For some, it's through friends and family, through a majestic moment like Pentecost or Isaiah's vision in the temple last week. For Samuel, it was quiet and easily misattributed, and it found a way to fit into the flow of the day, coming at the more relaxed moment in his day. Maybe we can hear the voice of God better when we're not overfilled with daily tasks, when we're allowed to listen for Sabbath, when we're quiet. Samuel, who is just beginning his ministry, is suddenly called to the related but not identical task of prophecy. An example to us of how God might be heard in our lives and how little we can often perceive that invitation. And the story of Samuel invites us to take up whatever part it is that we have been given as part of God's family. To understand his role change, we have to return to that communal nature for the faith community. That context was central, and a vision for full equality, an understanding of the complementary skills and interdependence that is necessary for a proper functioning of the whole, so that we can celebrate God most appropriately. Knowing our own gifts, discerned through reflection and life experience, is part of what brings us into the community that we are. That we have in our midst incredible bakers and organizers and gardeners and historians makes the shared burden of life easier when another has the skills that you are less proficient with. What Samuel will be called to, our lectionary doesn't reveal. A short read ahead will tell you, though, that he's called to be present for very hard times for the people of Israel, and a personally vulnerable oracle specifically for his mentor. But he goes into this open-hearted, vulnerable, and what seems to be with an open-ended willingness to hear God's message. And participating in God's realm in this way, he might be, I might argue, he is closer to the intent of those Sabbath laws. Even when not discussing the Sabbath particularly, Samuel is listening deeply for how God's mighty hand has saved, and is presently invested in saving the people, reminding that exploitation is not God's way, for the people of Israel, for the Egyptians who persecuted them, for those inside his own Jewish community who were exploiting as well. Rest is critical for Sabbath, but Sabbath is much more than rest. It's an active, engaged, focusing on the we of society that Samuel is being called to in this passage. Rather than inactive Sabbath work is counterintuitive, as it needs our individual commitments to a community ordering of society around cycles of memory-driven action. Sabbath work is counterintuitive. It needs our individual commitment to community ordering. We have to remember through cycles of memory-driven action. Keep the Sabbath holy. Not by following the rules to perfection, but by understanding the rules and listening for where God is calling you, to look beyond them like Jesus, to reflect on the divine and our place in the systems of God's realm, like the writers of the Psalm and the Epistle, or by answering the call to move, to tell hard truths, to walk a journey of discovery. Here I am, Lord, your servant is listening. Amen.
This has been the weekly worship from the United Church of Christ of Hummelstown. No matter who you are, or where you are, on life's journey, you are welcome here. Join us online or in person, at 104 East Main Street in Hummelstown, Sundays at 10:30 a.m. Thank you for listening today. We look forward to your fellowship.